Hi everyone. So for this week's lecture, I want to continue to provide some cultural context to help us understand what's happening in Pride and Prejudice. In today's reading, a lot of traveling occurs. Bingley and his sisters go to London. The Gardiners come to Longbourn. Jane goes to London. Charlotte moves to Hertfordshire. Lizzie and Charlotte's father and sister go to visit her in Hertfordshire, and Mr. Darcy shows up in Rosings. So the world of Pride and Prejudice has suddenly gotten a bit bigger, and I want to provide some context for understanding that world. First of all, I like to focus on London and what it would have been like in 1805. We know from the novel that Mr. Gardiner is involved in trade. All we know that is a very respectable line, and that the trade involves several warehouses. We don't know exactly what that trade would be, and it could in fact refer to any number of businesses or manufacturing enterprises. We do know that in 1805, the Industrial Revolution was starting to change the face of London. Factories allowed products to be made in much larger quantities at much greater speed, and with much less human labor. This meant that the people who ran the factories or worked in other trades that supported the burgeoning industries of England were able to make quite a bit of money. Though it should be noted that the workers themselves, especially as the century would progress on, made comparatively little and often had to put up with long work days and poor working conditions. If you remember last week's lesson, you'll remember that we discussed the fact that the gentry, who made money off of land, were one of the two wealthiest classes in British society, with the aristocracy. Along with that came a lot of expectations for how they would behave and the kind of example they would set for the lower classes. The idea, called noblesse oblige, means that nobility, in return for the good fortune of being born into their class, had the responsibility to set an example for the rest of society. Money reinforced both their place in society and their sense of responsibility. However, with the growth of trade and industry came a growth of what we'd consider new money, people from the lower classes who were suddenly able to live a lot like the upper classes. Suddenly, a certain sense of manners and breeding and land ownership became the only things that seemed to separate those born into the gentry class from several who were not. Much of what was called society in the world of Jane Austen took place in London during what was called the season. The idea was that people of means spent most of their year out in the country, taking care of estates and living in large drafty houses. During the winter, it did not make financial sense to maintain such big houses, so many families would go to a second home in London. During this time, there would be balls and parties. It would be a chance for girls of marriageable age to meet eligible men and get engaged. It will also be a chance to catch up with the latest fashions and gossip. Typically, a girl's first season in attendance of all these balls and parties would be referred to her coming out, something the equivalent of being a debutante. Courtship was a lot shorter than we are used to it being today. Well, now we might expect someone to date 1 or many years before becoming engaged, and engagement might last several months or years as well. Courtship and engagement at the beginning of the 19th century was often a matter of months total. Some of this had to do with the fact that within the gentry class of Britain, only about 400 families existed in total. So even if you didn't know someone on a personal level, you or your friends probably knew that of their family or could easily find out information. Reputation, family, and wealth all factored into whom was appropriate to court and marry, but many young men and women in the gentry, military, and merchant classes had notable freedom to find and choose their own spouses. While courtship was a mostly public affair, public spaces such as dances, family gatherings, and some out-of-door spaces allowed opportunities for men and women to interact with one another without seeming improper. All that being said, there were precautions that were taken to make sure that an imprudent or unsafe match was not made. Since a woman could not initiate divorce in the early 19th century, and any money she made before marriage became her husband's, it was vitally important that she marry someone who would not mistreat her or land her in financial ruin. This is why courtship was a very public affair. It's also why the Church of England had a mandatory engagement period, more or less. In churches, for a few Sundays running, the priest would call the banns, basically letting the community know that two people were planning to get married and making sure that there wasn't any known previous marriages or other legal problems. It also acted as a way to vet a marriage before it happened. I spoke for a while about life in town, but it's also worth noting what the country would be like. Oh, and there's a courting couple. Um, so last week I mentioned that the fact that the gentry were the land owning class, and I've just mentioned the fact that they lived on this land in large manor houses. So the English country house was a sign of status. Bingley in Pride and Prejudice, we see, has just inherited all the money his father made. And you can see that he plans to build a house with it to establish his place in society. Well, the Bennets would have had a very comfortable and large house. The truly great country houses belong to the most successful of families. Pemberley, the house that we know Darcy lives in, is one of these houses, and so is Rosings, where Lady Catherine lives. These houses were not just places to live in, but works of art, showcasing, as you can see in these pictures, architecture, also decoration. They were libraries containing vast collections of books in a world in which access to books was growing but still limited. And they were museums. They would showcase generations of a family's art collection. They also sat on large grounds which were surrounded by well-kept gardens, and good families would allow travelers and the public to come appreciate the grounds and even look around the inside of the home. So I hope that this context helps you as you process through Pride and Prejudice for this week, and I look forward to discussing it further with you on Wednesday for some of y'all and Thursday for others. Bye!